A millionaire adopts a black baby girl. Years later, he painfully realizes he made a terrible mistake. The rain came down in a fine drizzle, soft enough to blur the edges of the grimy windows lining the orphanage's front hall. Inside, the light from flickering overhead bulbs stretched thin, casting long shadows that seemed to deepen the damp chill of the air. The place smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Charles Erickson adjusted the collar of his tailored overcoat, his polished shoes clicking faintly on the worn linoleum floor. He ignored the nagging dampness clinging to his cuffs, his attention fixed on the woman walking briskly ahead of him. "This is our main dormitory," the head caretaker said over her shoulder, her voice sharp and clipped, the sound of someone used to being efficient, not empathetic. "Most of the children stay here unless they've been sent to foster homes temporarily. Are you looking for someone particular, Mr. Erickson?" Charles stopped short, glancing around. The room she had led him into was lined with low, creaking beds. Each had a folded blanket at its foot, its dull grey fibres pilling from repeated use. Children shuffled through the aisles, some huddled in clusters, whispering with darting glances toward the tall man in the expensive suit. Others sat alone, their small bodies curled into instinctive defenses against the world. Charles scanned their faces. "I'm looking for someone who stands out," he said carefully, keeping his voice low, as if to avoid jarring the somber atmosphere. "Not in the obvious sense, but, someone who feels ready." "Ready?" The caretaker tilted her head slightly. She'd dealt with wealthy benefactors before. Some of them searched for perfect specimens, others for projects to fix. None had used that word. Charles didn't answer. His gaze had settled on a figure at the far corner of the room, seated cross-legged on a thin mattress. The girl was slight, her shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear into the faded walls. Her hair was tightly coiled and cropped short, framing a face that was both solemn and watchful. In her hands, she clutched a threadbare blanket, its edges frayed from frequent use. The pale yellow fabric looked impossibly fragile against her dark skin. The girl wasn't looking at him. She was staring out of the window, her wide, liquid eyes following the faint lines of rain tracing the glass. She didn't flinch when Charles stepped closer. "What's her name?" he asked. "That's Ashley," the caretaker said. Her tone softened almost imperceptibly. "She's quiet, keeps to herself mostly. She's been here since the fire." Charles frowned slightly, but didn't press. He crouched down until he was at eye level with Ashley. Up close, she seemed even smaller, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. For a moment, he said nothing, unsure if words would cut through the invisible armor she wore. "Hello, Ashley," he said, finally. His voice was quiet, the practiced warmth of someone used to commanding attention without demanding it. Ashley turned her head slowly. Her eyes met his, and Charles felt an unexpected tug deep in his chest. It wasn't the bright curiosity of a child meeting someone new. It was a steadiness, a way of looking through him rather than at him, as if weighing the worth of his presence. The silence stretched. "I'm Charles," he offered. "It's nice to meet you." Her hands tightened their grip on the blanket. She said nothing, but her gaze lingered a moment longer before drifting back to the rain. The caretaker cleared her throat. "Ashley isn't quick to warm up," she explained, clearly embarrassed by the lack of response. "But she's a good girl. No trouble." Charles didn't move. "Ashley," he tried again. "Do you like stories?" This time her head tilted slightly, a tiny shift that felt like a victory. "I know a good one," Charles said, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "It's about a girl who's very brave. She doesn't think she is, but she's stronger than she knows." Ashley's fingers relaxed a fraction. Her eyes darted to his face, then back to her lap. For the first time, she spoke, her voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the room. "What happens to her?" Charles smiled faintly. "She finds a new place. One where she can make her own story. A good one." Ashley didn't answer, but her shoulders dropped slightly, her frame less rigid. Charles straightened and turned to the caretaker. "I'll take her," he said simply. The paperwork was expedited, Charles's wealth ensuring the usual delays vanished. By the end of the week, Ashley stood at the orphanage's entrance, clutching the handle of a small suitcase. She wore a coat a size too large, her thin frame almost swallowed by its bulk. Charles waited by the car, holding the door open. As the car pulled away, the orphanage's dull silhouette blurred into the rain. In a corner of the dormitory, the bed where Ashley had once slept remained empty, the pale grey blanket folded neatly at its foot. Outside, the rain fell heavier, and a quiet figure watched through the window, Ronald, unnoticed and still unknown. The rain hadn't let up. A steady drizzle clung to the air, turning the city streets into a patchwork of reflective puddles. The black sedan pulled up to the curb outside the orphanage, its tires crunching over the gravel. The back door opened, and a woman stepped out, her coat already damp from the short drive. She leaned into the car and emerged, holding a small boy wrapped in a hospital-issued blanket, his face pale, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft but weary. She adjusted him against her hip as his arms clung weakly to her neck, his grip more reflex than intention. His fever had broken, but his body still radiated heat, a lingering reminder of the fire that had torn his life apart. Inside the orphanage, the caretaker barely glanced up as the social worker entered. The woman behind the desk shuffled through a stack of papers without urgency. "This one's Ronald," the social worker said, her voice low. She shifted her weight, trying to shield the boy from the draft that snaked through the cracked windows. "He's 2. Been at the hospital since the fire." The caretaker finally looked up, her eyes scanning the boy with detached efficiency. "Any other family?" "None that we know of." The social worker's tone carried a faint edge, as though the question shouldn't have needed asking. The caretaker nodded, reaching for a clipboard. "Name?" "Ronald," she repeated. "No last name on file." The pen scratched against paper. "Medical conditions?" "Recovered from smoke inhalation, but he's still weak. Might need extra care for a few weeks." The caretaker made a non-committal sound. She waved a hand toward the dormitory. "Third room on the left. There's a spare bed." The social worker hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the boy's frail body. "He's been through a lot," she said quietly. "Lost his parents. Doesn't talk much." The caretaker didn't meet her gaze. "Most of them don't," she replied, standing and beckoning them to follow. The dormitory was dim, the faint smell of damp bedding hanging in the air. Rows of small beds lined the walls, each identical in its sparse simplicity. The caretaker gestured to an empty bed near the corner, the blanket folded neatly at its foot. "This'll do," she said briskly. The social worker knelt, lowering Ronald onto the mattress. The boy sat stiffly, his small frame almost swallowed by the too large blanket draped over his shoulders. He looked around the room with wide, unfocused eyes, his expression neither curious nor fearful. It was as though he was bracing himself for something he couldn't name. The social worker crouched in front of him, brushing a damp curl from his forehead. "You'll be okay here," she said softly. "These nice people will take care of you." Her voice faltered slightly, and she cleared her throat. Ronald didn't respond. His fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, gripping it tightly as though it were the only thing tethering him to the world. "I'll check in when I can," the woman added, more to herself than to him. She straightened, gave the caretaker a final look, and left without another word. The door clicked shut, and the caretaker sighed, glancing at the boy. "All right, Ronald," she said, her tone not unkind, but entirely perfunctory. "Rules are simple. Don't cause trouble and you'll get along fine." Ronald blinked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Dinner's in an hour," she said. "Stay here until then." She turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Ronald remained where she had placed him, his small hands fidgeting with the frayed edge of the blanket. Around him, the room hummed with faint whispers and the occasional creak of bed springs. The other children barely glanced at him, too preoccupied with their own quiet routines. In the corner, Ronald's bed sat directly beneath a narrow window, the glass streaked with rain. He stared at it for a long time, the faint sound of water dripping outside filling the silence. Slowly, he curled up on the mattress, tucking his knees to his chest. The blanket slipped slightly, revealing the faint smudges of soot still clinging to his neck, a lingering ghost of the fire. His small body sank into the mattress, which creaked softly under his weight. Unbeknownst to anyone, the bed had once belonged to Ashley, his sister. The same mattress had cradled her quiet frame as she clutched a blanket much like his, her wide eyes also staring out the same rain-streaked window. Now, it held Ronald, who curled into himself, too young to remember her, but old enough to feel the emptiness she left behind. The room buzzed with the low hum of orphanage life, indifferent to the small boy who now lay within it. As the rain tapped against the glass, Ronald drifted into a restless sleep, his fists still gripping the only thing he could call his own. The late summer sun filtered through the orphanage courtyard, soft light glinting off the worn gravel paths where a group of children played. Ronald, now 10, sat cross-legged at the edge of the courtyard, carving aimlessly into the dirt with a stick. The other children's laughter seemed distant, muffled beneath the constant hum of questions that filled his mind. He had learned long ago to keep them to himself. "Hey, Kev," a boy called out, trotting over with a lopsided grin. "Why are you always by yourself? You're like a ghost." Ronald shrugged, his fingers tightening around the stick. He didn't look up. The boy plopped down next to him, brushing dust off his knees. "What about your family? You ever think about them?" Ronald flinched. It was a question he never knew how to answer. The word family felt like a shape he could see but never touch, always blurred at the edges. "I don't know," Ronald murmured. "What do you mean you don't know?" the boy pressed. "You gotta have somebody. You weren't dropped out of the sky." Ronald didn't respond. He could feel the boy's curious gaze, waiting for something he wasn't ready to give. Before the silence grew unbearable, the bell clanged from the main building, calling them inside. The boy jumped to his feet and sprinted off, leaving Ronald sitting alone with his thoughts. That night, Ronald lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight filtering through the window cast thin, pale stripes across the room. The other boys snored softly around him, their restless movements filling the silence. Ronald's mind churned. He thought of the fragments of memory he had carried with him for years, images and sensations that never quite fit together. A warm hand in his, the faint rhythm of a lullaby, the way her voice had soothed him even when the world seemed to burn around them. A girl. Had she been real? Ronald sat up abruptly, the blanket pooling around his waist. He glanced toward the window, the glass fogged slightly with the cool night air. The idea took root in his mind, fragile but persistent. He had a sister. Somewhere in the jumble of memories, he was certain now. He hadn't been alone. But where was she? Over the following weeks, Ronald's questions grew sharper. He began watching the staff more closely, hoping to overhear snippets of conversations that might give him answers. He scoured the old, dusty books in the small orphanage library, searching for anything about the fire he thought he remembered. But the library held little more than forgotten school texts and faded storybooks. Still, the questions wouldn't let him rest. One afternoon, he approached a staff member as she folded laundry in the common room. She barely looked up when he shuffled closer. "Miss Kelly," he began, hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is it, Ronald?" she asked without pausing her work. "Do you know where I came from? Like, before this place?" The staff member finally glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean, my family," Ronald said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Did I have one? I mean, before the fire?" Miss Kelly sighed, setting down the neatly folded shirt in her hands. "Ronald, I don't know much about what happened before you got here," she said gently. "I know you came after a fire. That's all in your file. But we don't keep much from back then." Ronald's shoulders slumped, disappointment settling heavily in his chest. "But," Miss Kelly added, her voice softening, "if you have family out there, maybe someday you'll find them. Or they'll find you." Ronald nodded, though her words did little to ease the gnawing emptiness inside him. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the same rain-streaked window he'd known since he was 2, Ronald made a silent promise. Someday, he would find the truth. He didn't know how, but he knew he couldn't live forever with this hole in his life. The room was awash with golden light from the grand chandelier overhead, its glow catching on the polished keys of the Steinway piano. Ashley sat at the bench, her fingers gliding over the ivory, weaving together the familiar melody of Beethoven's Für Elise. The sound filled the vast living room of Charles Erickson's home, echoing warmly off walls adorned with tasteful artwork and family portraits. Charles sat nearby in his leather armchair, a steaming mug of tea balanced on his knee. He watched her intently, his eyes reflecting quiet pride. "Beautiful," he said, as she struck the final note. Ashley turned toward him, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I missed a few notes." "Perfection is overrated," Charles replied with a chuckle. He set his mug down on the table and leaned forward. "What matters is the feeling. And you, my dear, play with heart." Ashley smiled at the compliment and slid off the bench, her socks skimming the cool marble floor. She wandered toward the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain. Outside, the last rays of sunlight cast a warm glow over the sprawling garden, its manicured hedges and fountains a testament to Charles's meticulous taste. "I wonder if I'll ever play perfectly," she said, more to herself than to him. "You'll find that what you seek is not always in perfection, but in the journey," Charles said, his voice taking on the thoughtful cadence that Ashley had come to love. Ashley's life in the Erickson home was idyllic in many ways. Charles was attentive, but not overbearing, encouraging her independence while providing her with every opportunity to thrive. Her days were filled with piano lessons, private tutors, and long walks through the estate's gardens. Yet, beneath the surface of this comfortable life, there was a faint, unspoken void. That night, Ashley sat cross-legged on her bed, a canopy of sheer fabric draped above her. She hugged a stuffed rabbit close to her chest, its worn ears a reminder of the life she barely remembered. The house was silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside her window. Her dreams, when they came, were always fragmented. She saw flames, the glow of them searing bright against the night. The air was thick with smoke, stinging her lungs and making her cough. Somewhere in the chaos, there was a hand, small like hers, yet strong, gripping tightly. She could hear a voice, though the words were always indistinct, muffled by the roar of the fire. She woke with a start, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For a moment, she sat in the dark, her hands gripping the edge of her blanket. The dreams came less frequently now. But when they did, they lingered, wrapping her in an uneasy haze. Over breakfast the next morning, Charles noticed her quiet demeanor. "Didn't sleep well?" he asked, sipping his coffee. Ashley shook her head, swirling her spoon in her bowl of oatmeal. "I had a dream again." Charles set his mug down, his brow furrowing. "The same one?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on her spoon. "There was someone with me. I think it was a boy. He was holding my hand." Charles's expression softened, but there was a flicker of something deeper, something unreadable in his eyes. "You were very young when I brought you home," he said gently. "It's possible you're remembering pieces of your life before then." Ashley looked up at him. "You've mentioned I was adopted. Did I have anyone else? Like a family?" Charles hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. "Your parents passed away in a fire. That's all I know for certain." His answer was careful, but Ashley didn't press further. Charles had always been honest with her, and she trusted him implicitly. Still, as she pushed her oatmeal around the bowl, the faint unease from her dream lingered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activities. Ashley attended her piano lesson and reviewed her science homework with her tutor, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the boy in her dream. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something just out of reach, a memory locked behind a door she didn't know how to open. The early morning sun cast long shadows over the streets, its light struggling to cut through the haze of dust stirred up by passing cars. Ronald wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, smearing dirt across his temple. He was 16 now, his frame tall and lean, his face sunburned from hours spent under the open sky. He leaned on the rake in his hand, pausing his work to watch a cluster of students spill out of the school gates across the street. Their laughter rang out, bright and careless, as they talked over each other about exams, dances, and weekend plans. Ronald's eyes lingered on them, his expression unreadable. His hands were rough with calluses, his nails cracked and lined with dirt, in sharp contrast to their smooth, unblemished skin. They carried backpacks and books while he held tools. He shook himself out of the reverie and bent to scoop the last of the clippings into a trash bag. A sharp whistle from across the yard made him glance up. "Move it, Ronald. We're not getting paid by the hour." It was his boss, a man with a perpetual scowl and a voice like gravel. Ronald muttered an acknowledgement and hefted the bag over his shoulder, his muscles protesting from a week of unrelenting work. That afternoon, Ronald found himself in the hallway of a nearby high school, pushing a mop bucket across the linoleum floor. The faint scent of ammonia lingered in the air as he worked, the rhythmic squeak of the mop against the tiles, his only company. The halls were empty now, the students gone, but their presence lingered in scrawled notes on chalkboards and forgotten notebooks tucked beneath desks. Ronald paused by the bulletin board near the cafeteria, his gaze snagging on a brightly colored poster pinned among announcements for clubs and scholarships. Cornell University, Open House. Experience the campus. Plan your future. The image of ivy-covered stone buildings stood out against the text, the scene glowing with possibility. Ronald leaned closer, his eyes scanning the details. The words felt distant, almost like they belonged to a different world. He didn't notice the janitor walking by until the man clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Thinking of applying?" the older man asked with a chuckle, his grin teasing, but not unkind. Ronald straightened, startled. "No," he said quickly, stepping back. "Just curious." The janitor shrugged, leaning on his broom. "Good school. Heard they take hard-working kids too. Might not be as impossible as you think." Ronald didn't respond. As the man walked away, Ronald turned back to the poster. The image of the university etched into his mind. That night, Ronald sat cross-legged on the floor of the shared room at the orphanage, counting the crumpled bills and loose change he had earned that week. His hands moved quickly, sorting the coins into neat stacks, but his mind was elsewhere. He imagined walking across a campus, like the one in the poster, his hands clutching textbooks instead of tools. He pictured himself in a classroom, his voice blending with others in a discussion. The dream felt fragile, like a bubble that might burst if he held on to it too tightly. "I'll get there," he murmured to himself, the words barely audible. "One day." His roommate, a boy sprawled on the bunk above him, snorted. "Talking to yourself again, Kev. You losing it?" Ronald ignored him, sweeping the coins into an old tin box. He slid it under the bed, where it joined the meager savings he'd scraped together over the past 3 years. The next morning, Ronald was back at work, this time pulling weeds from the cracks in the pavement outside a public library. The sun beat down on his back, but his thoughts were miles away, circling the idea of what it might take to make the dream real. His boss's voice broke through his thoughts. "Let's go, dreamer! Those weeds ain't pulling themselves." Ronald gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus. One step at a time, he thought. Later, as he packed up his tools, his gaze wandered to a nearby bookstore. The window display featured a stack of SAT prep books. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the few dollars in his pocket. Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee. Ronald scanned the shelves until he found the book, its bright cover promising strategies for success. The price tag made him wince, but he handed over the money without hesitation. Back at the orphanage that night, he opened the book under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The words swam in front of his tired eyes, but he didn't stop. Ronald's days blurred into a cycle of work and study. Each penny he earned went into the tin box, his resolve hardening with every dollar added. The poster of Cornell stayed vivid in his mind, a constant reminder of what he was working toward. Somewhere out there, Ronald believed, was a life bigger than the one he knew, a life worth fighting for. And he would fight no matter how long it took. In the quiet of the night, as the city settled into stillness, Ronald whispered to himself, "One day, I'll be more than this. One day, I'll make it." And though the path ahead seemed impossible, he clung to the faint, stubborn hope that kept him moving forward. Have the people listening to the story ever aspired to attend a university or major? Why not share your dream with everyone in the comments section? It would be great. The hedge trimmer buzzed steadily in Ronald's hands as he carefully shaped the shrubbery lining the path to Cornell University's historic lecture halls. The early autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly fallen leaves and damp earth. Around him, the campus was alive, with students rushing to classes, their voices merging into an indistinct hum. Ronald, now 19, paused to wipe his forehead, glancing toward the towering stone buildings that loomed above him. He marveled at the intricate architecture, ivy twisting up the old walls, the place radiating a sense of permanence and opportunity. He returned to his task, focused on the clean lines of the hedge, when a burst of laughter made him look up. A group of students passed by on the brick path, their carefree chatter punctuated by quick gestures and bright smiles. Among them was a girl who caught his eye. She stood out, not just because of her black hair pulled back into a neat ponytail or the confident way she carried herself, but because of something Ronald couldn't place. She laughed at something her friend said, her head tilting slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Ronald saw a face that seemed uncannily familiar. His hand faltered, the trimmer snagging on a branch. He turned off the machine, his eyes following her as she walked away, her laughter echoing faintly behind her. "Something wrong with the hedge, kid?" Ronald jumped, startled by his supervisor's bark. "No, sir. Sorry. I'll finish up." Ashley adjusted the strap of her bag as she walked into the student center with her friends. She loved the energy of the campus, the way it hummed with possibility. It was her second year at Cornell, and she had thrown herself into every aspect of university life. Debates, clubs, even the occasional late-night study session in the library. As they passed a row of hedges near the lecture hall, Ashley caught a glimpse of a young man in a groundskeeper uniform. He was tall, his face framed by dark curls damp with sweat. For a brief second, their eyes met. Her steps faltered, and her friends continued ahead without noticing. There was something arresting about his gaze, a sense of recognition she couldn't place. But the moment passed quickly, and she turned away, shaking off the odd feeling. The next day, Ronald was in the cafeteria, wiping down tables after the lunch rush. The hum of conversation filled the space, students seated in clusters, discussing assignments or scrolling on their phones. He worked methodically, keeping his head down, until he heard a familiar voice. "Excuse me," the girl said, standing beside the table he had just finished cleaning. Ronald looked up, startled. It was her, the girl from the path. "Thanks for keeping this place spotless," she said, her tone casual but genuine. "It can't be easy with so many people in here." Ronald blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, yeah, thanks. Just doing my job." She smiled, and Ronald felt an inexplicable pull. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't figure out why. "You go here?" she asked, gesturing around the cafeteria. Ronald shook his head quickly. "No, I work here." She nodded, as if that explained everything, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Before she could say more, one of her friends called her name, and she turned. "See you around," she said with a quick smile before walking away. Ronald stood frozen for a moment, his hands still clutching the rag. He watched her leave, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. Ashley rejoined her friends, her thoughts drifting back to the groundskeeper. There was something in his face that tugged at her memory, though she couldn't quite pin it down. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. "Who was that?" one of her friends teased. "No one," Ashley replied quickly. "Just someone who works here." Her friend shrugged, launching into a story about their upcoming midterms, but Ashley's mind lingered on the brief conversation. That evening, Ronald sat on the edge of his cot in the small room he rented off campus, replaying the interaction in his mind. He didn't know why the girl unsettled him so much. It wasn't just that she had noticed him, a rarity in itself, but the nagging feeling that he should know her. He stared at the ceiling, the faint sound of traffic filtering through the thin walls of his room. The encounter had stirred something in him, a memory that felt just out of reach. He thought of the faint dreams he sometimes had, of a small hand gripping his tightly, the smell of smoke, and a voice calling his name. Ronald exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. It didn't make sense. He didn't know her. He couldn't know her. But something inside him whispered otherwise. As Ashley walked back to her dorm that night, she paused on the bridge that spanned the gorge, cutting through campus. The rushing water below sent a cool mist into the air, and she leaned against the railing, gazing at the reflection of the moon on the surface. For the second time that day, her thoughts returned to the groundskeeper. There had been something in his face, something in the way he looked at her, that felt like recognition. She shook her head, laughing softly at herself. It was silly. They were strangers. And yet, as she turned toward the path that led to her dorm, the thought stayed with her. The shared tension between Ronald and Ashley began to pull tighter, an unspoken thread drawing them closer. Neither understood the strange familiarity, but both were left wondering about the other. Their worlds, so different, had intersected at Cornell, and the truth of their connection lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. The warm glow of the dining room chandelier cast soft shadows over the long table, where Ashley sat across from Charles, their plates half finished. The house felt unusually quiet that evening, save for the faint hum of the rain outside. Ashley had been unusually pensive throughout dinner, and Charles finally set his fork down, leaning back in his chair. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his tone patient. Ashley hesitated, poking at a stray piece of lettuce on her plate. "It's nothing really, just something strange happened at school." Charles tilted his head, his expression inviting her to continue. "There's this guy who works on campus," Ashley said slowly. "I think he's a groundskeeper. I ran into him a couple of times." She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of her glass. "It's weird, though. He kind of looks like me." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you?" "Yeah." Ashley shrugged, a faint frown crossing her face. "It's probably just a coincidence. But it felt strange. Familiar, almost." Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Did you talk to him?" "A little," Ashley admitted. "He's nice, quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I've seen him before." Charles's gaze lingered on her, his sharp mind already working through the implications. "What's his name?" "I don't know," Ashley admitted. "We didn't get that far." Later that evening, Charles sat in his study, a thick manila folder spread open on his desk. He rarely revisited Ashley's adoption records, but tonight, curiosity tugged at him with unusual force. The records were sparse, as he remembered, just a few scanned pages detailing the circumstances under which Ashley had been taken in. He scanned the lines of text until a particular detail caught his eye. Another child, admitted to the orphanage just days after Ashley had been adopted. Charles's brow furrowed. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Margaret, it's Charles Erickson. I need a favor." The next day, Ashley spotted Ronald again, this time near the student union. He was pushing a cart filled with gardening tools, his head down as he moved through the crowd. She hesitated for a moment, then quickened her pace to catch up. "Hey!" she called out, her voice cutting through the noise of passing students. Ronald turned, startled to see her again. "Oh, hi," he said awkwardly, shifting his grip on the cart. Ashley smiled, her curiosity overriding her usual shyness. "You're always working around here, huh?" "Yeah, keeps me busy," Ronald replied, his tone cautious but polite. "I didn't catch your name last time," Ashley said, extending a hand. "I'm Ashley." Ronald hesitated before shaking her hand. "Ronald." "Nice to meet you, Ronald," Ashley said. She glanced at the cart, then back at him. "Do you ever get a break?" "Sometimes," Ronald said with a faint smile. "Good. Because I was wondering if you'd like to come by for dinner," Ashley said, the words surprising even herself. "I mean, you're always working so hard. It might be nice to take a break." Ronald blinked, caught off guard. "Dinner?" "Yeah," Ashley said quickly. "It's nothing fancy. Just my guardian and me. I think he'd like to meet you." Ronald hesitated, his instincts urging him to refuse, but something in her tone made him nod. "Okay. Sure." That evening, Ronald found himself sitting awkwardly at the same long dining table where Ashley had spoken to Charles the night before. The house was warm and inviting, the smell of roasted chicken filling the air. Charles greeted Ronald with the same calm, measured demeanor that had always put Ashley at ease. He asked polite questions about Ronald's work, his background, his plans for the future. Ronald answered carefully, his voice quiet, but steady. As the meal wound down, Charles turned the conversation toward lighter topics. "I hear you're quite the worker," Charles said. Ashley mentioned how spotless the cafeteria looked. Ronald smiled faintly. "I try my best." Ashley watched him closely, still struck by the subtle similarities in their features. The same dark eyes, the same shape of their jawlines. Ronald's gaze drifted to the fireplace, his expression momentarily distant. "I don't remember much from when I was a kid," he said, almost to himself. "But I have these flashes sometimes, of a little girl. She used to sing to me." Ashley froze, her fork clattering against her plate. "Sing?" Ronald looked at her, surprised by her reaction. "Yeah, I think it was during a fire. I can't remember much else." For a moment the room was silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Ashley's hands tightened in her lap. I used to sing," she said quietly. "When I was little. It's one of the only things I remember from before I was adopted." Ronald's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. Charles watched the exchange carefully, his earlier suspicions now fully realized. "We'll need to talk," he said softly, his voice breaking the tension in the room. His gaze moved between Ronald and Ashley, a weight in his expression that neither of them could fully understand yet. The truth, long buried, was finally beginning to surface. The sterile air of the clinic felt unnaturally still. Ronald shifted uneasily in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Ashley sat beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder in the silence. Charles, seated across from them, glanced between the two. His usual composed demeanor held an uncharacteristic edge of tension. He had spent the past week piecing together fragments of information. Ronald's orphanage records, Ashley's adoption file, the details of the fire that Miller reported. Now, they sat waiting for confirmation of what his instincts already told him. "You don't have to be nervous," Ashley said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. Ronald glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "You're not?" She hesitated, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I didn't say that." Ronald huffed a soft laugh, leaning back in his chair. The exchange broke some of the tension in the room, but only slightly. A nurse appeared in the doorway, a folder in her hand. She looked at them briefly before nodding at Charles. "Mr. Erickson, we have the results," she said. The group followed her into a small, windowless office. A doctor was waiting behind a desk, the folder now open in front of him. He gestured for them to sit, his expression professional but kind. "We've completed the DNA analysis," the doctor began. "Based on the results, it's conclusive. Ronald and Ashley are siblings." The words landed heavily in the room. Ronald blinked, his breath catching as the weight of the revelation settled over him. He looked at Ashley, searching her face for a reaction. Ashley's eyes widened, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Siblings," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. Ronald exhaled sharply, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. Relief and disbelief warred within him, a tumult of emotions he couldn't yet untangle. Back at Charles's house that evening, the three of them sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Ashley was curled up in one corner of the sofa, her knees tucked to her chest. Ronald sat stiffly in an armchair, his eyes fixed on the flames. "It explains so much," Ashley said after a long silence. "Why you seemed so familiar, why I couldn't stop thinking about it." Ronald nodded slowly. "Yeah, but why didn't anyone tell us?" Charles cleared his throat, his expression heavy with regret. "When I adopted Ashley, I didn't know she had a sibling. The orphanage didn't mention it, and I didn't think to ask. Ronald's jaw tightened. You didn't think to check? I had no reason to suspect, Charles said gently, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. Ashley looked between the two men, her brow furrowed. It's not anyone's fault, she said softly. Ronald shook his head, his voice low. Maybe not. But it doesn't change what happened. You got a life, a real family. And I... He trailed off, his words swallowed by the bitterness in his tone. Ashley's heart ached at the raw emotion in his voice. It wasn't fair, she said, her own guilt rising to the surface. You should have had what I had. You deserve that too. Ronald's gaze softened slightly, but his frustration lingered. It's not about what I deserved. It's about what I lost. The room fell silent again, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Later, as Ronald prepared to leave, Charles approached him in the hallway. Ronald, he said quietly, I can't undo the past, but I want to help now if you'll let me. Ronald turned, studying Charles's face. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, Charles said simply. And because you're family now. Whether or not I knew it before, that's what you are. Ronald hesitated, his hands shoved into his pockets. Finally he nodded. I'll think about it. In her room, Ashley stared at the faint outline of the moon through her window. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories, fragments of the fire, the feeling of Ronald's hand in hers, the lullabies she had sung to comfort him. She thought of the years they had spent apart, of the stark differences in their lives. I'll make it right, she whispered to herself. For the first time, she felt the weight of responsibility, not just for what she had, but for the bond she and Ronald had been denied. As the house settled into quiet, Ronald sat in his small room, staring at the envelope Charles had given him. Inside was a check for an amount that made his head spin. Along with it, a letter from Charles offering support for his education, housing, and whatever else he needed to start a new chapter. Ronald's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter. The bitterness in his chest hadn't faded entirely, but beneath it was something new, a glimmer of hope. For the first time, the dream of building a better life didn't seem so impossible. The early morning light spilled through the wide windows of the Cornell University library, casting golden streaks across the polished wooden tables. Ronald sat in one of the quiet study rooms, his head bent over a thick textbook. His pen tapped lightly against the page as he worked through a dense calculus problem, the faint buzz of conversation in the main hall providing a distant backdrop. Need a break yet? Ronald looked up to see Ashley standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in each hand. She smiled, setting one down in front of him. Thanks, Ronald said, leaning back in his chair. He stretched, his muscles stiff from hours of studying. You're up early. Ashley pulled out a chair and sat across from him. I figured I'd check in before my class. How's it going? Ronald hesitated, glancing at the textbook. Better than I thought it would. I mean, it's a lot, but I'm keeping up. Ashley nodded, her smile widening. That's because you're smart. I keep telling you that. Ronald chuckled softly, his hand wrapping around the warm coffee cup. Yeah, well, not everyone at this school sees it that way. Ashley frowned. What do you mean? Ronald shrugged, looking down at the table. Some of the students, they don't really talk to me. I think they still see me as the guy who mowed the lawns. Ashley's expression softened. They'll come around, and if they don't, that's their problem, not yours. You belong here just as much as anyone else. Ronald met her gaze, the sincerity in her voice easing some of the tension in his chest. Over the next few weeks, Ronald settled into campus life with Ashley's help. She introduced him to her friends, showed him the best places to study, and insisted he join her for coffee runs between classes. Slowly, the initial awkwardness between them began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie. One afternoon, Ashley convinced Ronald to take a break and join her for a walk through the campus gardens. The trees were just beginning to turn, their leaves a riot of oranges and reds. "I used to come here all the time when I first started," Ashley said, her hands stuffed into her jacket pockets. "It's my favorite spot on campus. Feels like you can breathe here, you know?" Ronald nodded, his eyes scanning the vibrant foliage. "I can see why you like it." They walked in silence for a while before Ashley spoke again. "I was thinking about what you said the other day, about not feeling like you fit in." Ronald glanced at her, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I think I know how you feel," she admitted. "When I was younger, I always felt like there was something missing. Even with Charles and everything he gave me, there was this emptiness I couldn't explain." Ronald's steps slowed, her words hitting closer to home than he expected. "I guess we both got pieces of what we needed, but not the whole thing," he said quietly. Ashley nodded, her expression thoughtful. "But maybe now we can make up for it. Together." Ronald looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, maybe we can." By the end of the semester, Ronald had found his rhythm. He excelled in his classes, earning the respect of both his professors and his peers. His natural talent for problem-solving shone in group projects, and his determination inspired those around him. Charles, true to his word, supported Ronald every step of the way. He attended Ronald's presentations, offering quiet encouragement and the occasional piece of advice. Watching Ronald thrive brought Charles a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. "You've come a long way," Charles said one evening, handing Ronald a glass of water as they sat in the living room. Ronald looked at him, the words carrying a weight he hadn't expected. "Thanks," he said simply. "No," Charles said, his voice firm. "Thank you for letting me be part of this. I've made my share of mistakes, but seeing you and Ashley reconnect, it's one of the best things that's ever happened to me." Ronald nodded, the lump in his throat making it hard to respond. One night, as Ashley and Ronald sat on the steps of the library, Ashley turned to him with a mischievous grin. "You know, we never really celebrated you getting here." Ronald raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Ashley said, standing and gesturing dramatically, "you made it to Cornell. That's huge. We should do something to mark the occasion." Ronald laughed, shaking his head. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe," Ashley said, sitting back down, her grin softening into a smile. "But I'm serious. You've worked so hard to get here. You deserve to celebrate." Ronald looked out at the campus, the lights twinkling in the distance. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. "Maybe we'll celebrate after finals," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Deal," Ashley said, nudging him playfully. As they sat together, the bond between them continued to grow, built on shared struggles, newfound respect, and the unshakable connection of family. The house was unusually quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the study. Charles sat in his favorite armchair by the window, a wool blanket draped over his lap. Outside, the late autumn leaves fluttered in the breeze, their vibrant colors dulled by the gray sky. He held a glass of water in his trembling hand, his once steady fingers now betraying his age. His breath was shallow, and his body felt heavy, but his mind was sharp as ever. He watched the leaves dance and reflected on the life he had built, not just the wealth and the accolades, but the family he had unexpectedly gained. Ashley's laughter drifted faintly from another room. The sound brought a smile to his lips. It had been years since he had first met her at the orphanage, a timid little girl clutching her blanket. She had grown into a bright, compassionate young woman, her confidence shining in everything she did. And Ronald. Charles's chest swelled with pride at the thought of the boy who'd worked his way into their lives. Ronald's quiet determination and resilience had reminded Charles of his own struggles in his youth. Watching Ronald and Ashley rebuild the bond that had been stolen from them had been the greatest joy of his later years. Charles's health declined rapidly in the following weeks. Ashley and Ronald took turns sitting by his bedside, sharing stories from their day, their presence a comfort in his final moments. One evening, Ashley held his hand as he rested, his breathing slow and labored. "You gave us everything," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." Charles opened his eyes, his gaze soft but steady. "You've already given me more than I could ever ask for," he said, his voice a faint rasp. "You and Ronald, you're my legacy. Just promise me one thing." Ashley leaned closer, her tears falling silently. "Anything." "Take care of each other," Charles said, "no matter what." Ashley nodded, squeezing his hand. "I promise." The day Charles passed was cold and overcast, the sky heavy with unfallen rain. Ronald stood beside Ashley in the family plot, the weight of the moment pressing on both of them. As the service ended and the mourners dispersed, Ashley and Ronald lingered. They stood in silence for a long time before Ronald spoke. "He gave me a chance," Ronald said quietly, "when no one else would. I don't think I ever told him how much that meant to me." Ashley placed a hand on his arm. He knew. He always knew. Ronald nodded, his jaw tightening as he fought back tears. A week later, Charles's lawyer met with Ashley and Ronald to discuss his will. They sat in the grand study where Charles had spent countless evenings reading and planning. The lawyer opened a thick envelope, pulling out a neatly typed letter. "To my dearest Ashley and Ronald," the letter began. Ashley's hand instinctively sought Ronald's as the lawyer continued. "From the moment I met each of you, my life changed in ways I never imagined. Ashley, you brought light and laughter into my home when I needed it most. Ronald, you reminded me of the strength that comes from perseverance and hope. Together, you have given me the family I thought I would never have." The letter detailed Charles's wishes, leaving his entire estate to Ashley and Ronald in equal shares. He had also established a foundation in their names to support underprivileged children, ensuring that his legacy of compassion would continue. At the bottom of the letter, Charles had written in his own hand, "Family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stand by you, who lift you up when you fall, and who remind you that you're never alone. I hope you'll carry this lesson forward, not just for yourselves, but for everyone whose lives you touch." Later that evening, Ashley and Ronald sat in the living room, the crackling fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Between them on the coffee table lay a photo album Charles had kept, a record of their lives together. Ashley flipped through the pages, pausing at a photo of herself as a child, her hands covered in paint after a messy art project. "He always said I had the makings of an artist," she said with a bittersweet smile. Ronald pointed to another photo, this one of himself and Charles at a university event. "He believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself," he said softly. Ashley reached for Ronald's hand. "He would be so proud of us, of how far we've come." Ronald nodded, his grip firm. "We'll make sure his legacy lives on, together." As the night deepened, the siblings sat side by side, the warmth of the fire a comforting presence. The pain of losing Charles lingered, but so did the strength of his final gift. Their bond, renewed and unbreakable. They had lost so much, but in each other they had found what they thought was gone forever. Family. And as they planned their next steps, they knew they would honor Charles not just in words, but in the lives they built together. Autumn a few years later, they go back to where it all began. The orphanage looked smaller than Ashley had remembered. Its grey stone walls were weathered, the paint on the shutters chipped and faded. Yet there was something comforting in its familiar simplicity. She stood at the entrance, the crisp autumn air brushing against her face. Beside her, Ronald lingered, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "This is where it all began," Ashley said softly, her gaze fixed on the heavy wooden door. "For both of us," Ronald replied, his voice low. He took a deep breath. "And where it all fell apart." Ashley glanced at him, catching the flicker of emotion that passed over his face. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "But we're here now. Together." Ronald nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Inside, the halls echoed with faint laughter and the shuffle of small feet. The scent of floor polish mingled with the faint tang of old wood. It was both exactly as Ashley remembered and entirely different. A caretaker greeted them, her smile warm and genuine. "You must be the Erickson twins," she said, ushering them inside. "It's such an honor to have you here." Ashley and Ronald exchanged a glance at the mention of twins. It still felt surreal to hear. The caretaker led them through the orphanage, pointing out new renovations funded by recent donations. "We've been able to expand the dormitories and add a dedicated playroom thanks to your foundation's contributions," she said. They stopped in a small room near the end of the hall. The air seemed heavier here, the quiet more profound. "This was your room, Ashley," the caretaker said, her voice softening. Ashley stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the narrow beds lined up against the walls. The memories came rushing back. The cold nights, the whispered conversations between children, the sense of waiting for something she couldn't name. Ronald lingered at the doorway, his eyes scanning the space. "I was here too, wasn't I?" he asked quietly. The caretaker hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. A few days after Ashley left, you were brought in, but no one knew you were siblings." Ashley turned to Ronald, her heart aching at the thought of him arriving here alone. "I remember," Ronald said, his voice distant. "I sat right there by the window." He pointed to a bed near the corner. "I didn't know why, but I always felt like something was missing." Ashley crossed the room, standing beside him. "It was me," she said, her voice trembling. Ronald looked at her, his expression softening. "And it was you who brought me back." Later that day, Ashley and Ronald stood in the orphanage's small courtyard, watching as children played on the swings and chased one another through the crisp leaves. The sound of their laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence both siblings had known during their time here. Ashley turned to Ronald. "I've been thinking. We could do more." Ronald raised an eyebrow. "More than the foundation?" Ashley nodded. "I want to start a non-profit, something that helps reunite families who've been separated, kids like us. If we could find each other, maybe we can help others do the same." Ronald's lips curved into a small smile. "That sounds like you," he said. "Always trying to fix the world." "And you?" Ashley asked, nudging him lightly. "What's your plan?" Ronald looked back at the children playing, his gaze thoughtful. "A scholarship fund," he said finally, "for kids who never get the chance to dream because they're too busy surviving. If Charles taught me anything, it's that everyone deserves an opportunity." Ashley reached for his hand, her grip firm and steady. "He'd be so proud of you." Ronald squeezed her hand in return. "Of both of us." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ronald and Ashley stood by their car, the orphanage now a silhouette against the fiery sky. "We've come a long way," Ronald said, his voice tinged with both awe and gratitude. Ashley smiled, her eyes glistening. "And we've still got so much to do." Ronald nodded. "Together." They climbed into the car, their plans for the future forming in quiet, determined conversation. Months later, the first recipients of the Erickson Scholarship walked across the stage at a small ceremony, their faces lit with pride and hope. At the same time, Ashley's non-profit, Reunited Hearts, announced its first successful family reunion, a story that brought tears to everyone who heard it. The twins honored Charles's legacy not just through their work, but in the way they carried his lessons forward, with compassion, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the power of family. As they stood together on the steps of their non-profit's new headquarters, the Erickson twins looked out at the bustling city, their hearts full of hope. "We've come full circle," Ashley said softly. Ronald smiled, "And this is just the beginning." Together they stepped forward, ready to continue the legacy that had brought them back to each other and given them the strength to change the world. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.